Hello class, and welcome to lecture 29 of Philosophy 205. This is the final lecture of the course. Just want to apologize for getting this up late. Something went wrong, so it wasn't up on time. I had to re-record it. So here we go. Let's hope this works. Today we'll be looking beyond foundationalism. Sober in this chapter presents his view of how we should respond to a lot of these problems with knowledge, especially Hume's problem of induction, but also the problem of skepticism and other problems. The question he's asking here is, what is the real structure of knowledge? He's going to adopt something like coherentism, but maybe not exactly the coherentism we described before. And he thinks that if we think about knowledge in a different way, we'll be able to avoid a lot of the problems that we ran into before. So first of all, let's think about the different kinds of beliefs that we have. So at level 3, we've got predictions and generalizations. If you get lower level, there are direct observations. And at the lowest level, there are indubitable beliefs. So in the sciences, we're trying, to a large extent, to make predictions and generalizations. We're trying to draw conclusions about things that we have not yet seen. We're trying to draw conclusions about the universe as a whole. The laws of nature are generalizations, and whenever we use scientific knowledge to design something in the future, we're making predictions. Now, ideally, these predictions and generalizations will be based on direct observations, and there are also some beliefs that we simply can't doubt. So beliefs about mathematics, beliefs about our own existence. So now the question this raises is this: can we justify beliefs at different levels? Now, according to Sober, the reason we so often run into problems in explaining how knowledge is possible is we think about this question the wrong way. So what Sober does is he goes through the history of philosophy, looks at especially Descartes and Hume, and shows that the problems that they came up with, the problems that they struggled to solve, only arose because of faulty assumptions that they made about the nature of knowledge. So let's look at some parallels between Hume and Descartes. So if you recall, Descartes' problem was trying to explain how we can know anything about the outside world, given that, according to him, knowledge must be certain. So he started from claiming that we can be certain about the content of our own minds, and then, once we can be certain that God exists, then we can know about the world. But his problem was this: there's always room to doubt claims about the external world. I mean, we know we exist, but there's always a chance we could be wrong about what we're seeing. Things that might be the way they appear. So is his problem. Hume's problem was how we can justify using observations about the past to draw conclusions about what we haven't observed. Because there's always a chance that what we haven't observed might be different. So let's look at the parallels between these problems. Descartes' problem was how we can go from beliefs about our own mental states, which according to him couldn't be doubted, to justify beliefs about the world. It's not clear how only knowing what's in your own mind tells you what's going on outside your mind. Hume's problem is how beliefs about the past can justify beliefs about the future, or how beliefs about the observed can justify beliefs about the unobserved. So both of them have a similar structure. Both of them start with a set of beliefs that they claim are justified, and then both of them ask, well, how can we get from there to these other beliefs that we have questions about? So they're both a very similar problem. And Sober claims that foundationalism itself causes these problems. He claims that it's assuming foundationalism that puts us in a situation where we can't get from one to the other. The reason Descartes came up against this problem of having knowledge about the external world is he thought that we had to build up from a foundation. So according to him, the foundation of beliefs that were justified were beliefs about our own mind. And his thought was, well, that has to be a foundation. We have to build from there to justify other things. So it's the assumption of foundationalism, the idea that knowledge must have this foundational structure that led to the problem in the first place. Similarly for Hume. Hume's idea is our observations are justified. We're justified in believing that we've seen what we've seen. But the question is, how can those beliefs which are justified justify further beliefs? So he claims that there's this foundation of beliefs that we're justified in, and in order for these other beliefs to be justified, they need to build up from that foundation. So once again, it's the assumption of foundationalism that led to the problem, assuming that in order for all of our beliefs to be justified, they have to be built up from these foundations. Sober's solution then is to reject foundationalism. So if we don't need to build from the foundations, then perhaps the beliefs we care about can be justified. Maybe the beliefs about the external world can be justified. Maybe generalizations can be justified. Maybe we can be justified in making predictions. And because so much of what we do depends on making predictions, depends on making generalizations, and depends on knowing what's around us, that's a big deal. So to help explain why we should reject foundationalism, Sober points to background assumptions and the role they play in evidence. So think about the function of evidence in having a rational belief. Normally we would say your beliefs are rational if they are based on good evidence. But does the evidence itself simply lead straight to a rational belief? According to Sober, it doesn't. According to Sober, whether something is evidence in the first place depends on background assumptions. So when you make an observation and you take that to be evidence in favor of a claim, that can only be evidence in favor of a claim given an assumption. So for example, vision is evidence there is a book, assuming vision is functioning properly. So if it looks like there's a book on the table, that can be evidence that there is a book on the table, assuming that your vision is working properly. If you're assuming that everything around you is hallucinating, then that won't be good evidence that there's a book. So this is a very basic level of assumption, but it's still an assumption that we make. There are more complicated assumptions as well. So if you find somebody's fingerprints on a murder weapon, that counts as evidence that that person is the murderer, only under the assumption that there isn't another good reason for their fingerprints to be there. So you have to make assumptions about the situation in order for any piece of evidence or any proposition to count as evidence. And so here's another interesting example of this. Consider these urns. So we've got an urn. We draw 50 red balls from the urn. Now, what can we conclude about the urn? Does this give us evidence that every ball in the urn is red? Well, that might seem like it's good evidence that all the balls in the urn are red, but what if we have some background information? Suppose we know that we are looking at one of only two possible urns. One of the urns has 50 red balls in it and 50 green balls in it. The other one has only 10 red balls in it. Now we know that we have taken 50 red balls out of the urn in front of us. So given these background assumptions, the fact that we've pulled 50 red balls is pretty conclusive evidence that only half the balls are red. Because we know in order to get 50 red balls out of the urn, it's got to be this first urn. There are only 10 balls in the second one, so we couldn't pull 50 red balls out. So here we have a situation where pulling out 50 red balls is evidence that only half of the balls are red. And that's because we have some background information about what kinds of urns we could be looking at. So whether an observation counts as evidence for a claim depends on the background assumptions that we make. So in normal situations, if you pulled out 50 red balls, you'd think, well, almost all of the balls in here are red. Otherwise, I'd be pulling out balls of other colors. But in this situation, you realize, well, it's got to be the one that's only half red balls. And this would be the same conclusion if the first one had 50 red balls and 5,000 green balls, because that would still be the only way you could have pulled 50 red balls out of the urn. So this just goes to show that when we're thinking about evidence in the first place, and whether one belief justifies another, that depends on other beliefs we have. Evidence itself depends on background assumptions. This tells us something important about the structure of justification. It shows us that beliefs are mutually supporting. They form a system, and there are no basic beliefs. So this is something very similar to coherentism. But we can look at it in a slightly different way from the way we looked at coherentism before. So here I present Neurath's boat. Neurath presented his boat analogy to explain what's going on with justification. So here's how the analogy works. He claims that justification is like using a ship as a platform from which to rebuild the ship itself. Just like that ship, we use our current beliefs to refine our current belief-forming practices. So the idea is just this. Wherever we start, whatever practices we use to form beliefs, those are the very practices we need to use to improve themselves. So if we want to get better at finding the truth, we have to start with the methods we're using now. So even if we're starting with bad methods, those are the only methods we have. When we can't somehow jump outside of our own minds and stop using the only methods that we have available. So what we do is we use the methods that we have available. They will be imperfect, but they'll help us identify potentially better ways of forming beliefs. And then once we've done that, we can get rid of the methods we used before, the very methods we used to find the new methods. Then once we're using the new methods, we can identify yet further methods. And so it's very similar to being on a ship. You know the ship is falling apart, but you can't jump out of the ship because you'll drown. What you have to do is stay on the ship and use the ship as a platform to rebuild the ship itself. So if you have access to a lot of wood and tools, you can repair the ship while you're on the ship. In fact, that's your only option if you don't want to die. So that's kind of the situation that Neurath describes us as being in, and Sober endorses this idea. But this is how we should think about our own beliefs. Just to give kind of an example of how this works, in the past, when writing was first being invented, so humans would presumably make mistakes about what they remembered. They would go somewhere, think they remembered something happening, then when they checked, they'd be wrong. So maybe they thought that there were 2 paths going away from a river, then they go back and there's only one. But once writing is invented, they can realize that actually writing something down, making notes of it, is a better way to record information than just trying to remember it. So starting from the methods that early humans had available, they were able to discover a new method. And now that new method is better than the one they had before. And once you've used your primitive methods to identify a slightly better method, you can tell that the better method is better. And now you can rely less on the more primitive methods. And you can continue to do this and continue to identify more ways to form beliefs. And so eventually you end up with science. So you keep refining and refining your methods. You realize that when you're closer to something, you have a better view of it. And you realize that you can get a better view through microscopes, develop telescopes, and we can use all of these things to continue to improve our beliefs. But the point is, we never have to completely throw away what we started with. We have to start from somewhere. Even if we know it's imperfect, that's what we have to work with. We have to build from there. So what Sober is saying is that we don't have to take on the project that Descartes took on. We don't have to take on the project that Hume took on. We don't have to try to say, all right, we're going to start from scratch. Let's not trust anything we have right now and start over. Thinks that's ridiculous. We're not going to start over. We're going to start where we are and use what we have and see what's the best we can do with it. And so that's where I'm going to leave us in this course. The idea that we have to start where we are and try as best we can to refine the methods available to us to see if we can do better to answer the questions that we come across. All right, thanks for taking this course and good luck on the final.